We talked about recently that I sent you was this new AI ability, that AI has the ability to translate some of these ancient languages now, which is really interesting.
AI just reanalyzed the most famous face in Egypt and exposed the name attached to its story as the wrong one. For more than a century, the Great Sphinx of Giza has been identified as Pharaoh Khafre, a lion's body with the face of a king everyone believed they already understood. Archaeologists measured its proportions, debated its age, and studied it for generations, but no one had ever brought all of that evidence together through a modern AI analysis. That changed in 2026. The results did not point cleanly back to Khafre. Instead, they raised a question that could rewrite one of history's most famous monuments. If Egypt's most recognizable face was never Khafre's, then who have we been looking at all this time? Before we uncover what the AI found, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoy mysteries, archaeology, and discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew, you're in the right place. Now, let's start with what everyone thinks they know about the Great Sphinx, and why that story may be about to change. Let's begin with what almost everyone believes they already knows about the Great Sphinx, and then examine the evidence that belief is actually built upon. The monument stretches roughly 240 feet from its front paws to its tail and stands around 66 feet high. Instead of being assembled from blocks, it was carved directly out of a single mass of limestone on the Giza Plateau. According to the traditional account, the Sphinx was created during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BCE, as part of the same royal complex that includes the Second Pyramid. That explanation has been repeated for generations until it became accepted as fact. But when you ask what the conclusion is actually based on, the answer becomes surprisingly uncertain. There is no inscription on the Sphinx identifying who ordered it to be built. None at all. The connection to Khafre comes mainly from three pieces of circumstantial evidence: its location beside his pyramid complex, similarities in architectural style with nearby monuments, and the famous dream stele placed between the Sphinx's paws centuries later by Pharaoh Thutmose IV. That monument mentions the Sphinx, but it never clearly states that Khafre was its creator. For one of the world's most famous monuments, the direct evidence is far less definitive than many people assume. Before we look at what artificial intelligence uncovered, there is an important historical debate that deserves attention because it completely changes the context of the story. In 1974, Senegalese historian and scientist Cheikh Anta Diop addressed a UNESCO symposium in Cairo. Drawing on linguistics, cultural history, and his own research on mummified remains, he argued that ancient Egyptian civilization should be understood as an African civilization with deep roots in the rest of the continent. He also claimed that generations of Western scholarship had gradually separated Egypt from its African context, reshaping the way its history was presented to the world. His arguments immediately sparked intense disagreement. Many scholars rejected his conclusions, while others considered them an important challenge to long-standing assumptions. Decades later, that debate has never truly ended. Whether people agree with Diop or not, his work became one of the foundations of modern African historical scholarship. That matters because questions about the Sphinx are no longer limited to archaeology alone. They also touch on identity, history, and the way civilizations have been interpreted for generations. Another detail is often overlooked. The Sphinx still has no surviving inscription naming its builder. Its creator remains anonymous. The strongest link to Khafre continues to rely on indirect evidence and the dream stele of Thutmose IV. The damaged section of that inscription has been interpreted differently over the years. Most Egyptologists believe it refers to Khafre, while some researchers argue the broken hieroglyphs leave room for other readings. That uncertainty is easy to overlook, but it becomes significant when discussing a monument of this importance. Long before Egyptology developed into a formal academic discipline, travelers from Europe described the Sphinx simply as they saw it. During the 19th century, French novelist Gustave Flaubert commented on its broad nose and full lips, describing features he associated with Africa. Earlier still, the French scholar Comte de Volney made similar observations and remarked on the contradiction of Europeans admiring Egypt's monuments while enslaving people whose appearance, in his view, resembled that of the monument itself. These writers were not participating in today's historical debates. They were simply recording their impressions decades before modern arguments had taken shape. Then, in 2026, researchers approached the mystery from an entirely different direction. Instead of relying on individual observations, they assembled nearly every available measurement of the Sphinx's face into a single AI-driven analysis. The system processed decades of survey data, facial proportions, historical drawings, and previous reconstruction work, including research by forensic artist Frank Domingo, who had spent years helping the New York Police Department reconstruct faces from eyewitness descriptions. Domingo's earlier comparison had already raised an uncomfortable question. When he examined the Sphinx alongside authenticated statues of Pharaoh Khafre displayed in the Cairo Museum, he concluded that the facial structures did not match as closely as expected if both represented the same individual. Differences appeared in the jawline, facial angles, and overall proportions. At the time, those findings attracted limited attention and were largely overshadowed by the long-established consensus. But decades later, AI would revisit the same evidence from an entirely new perspective, and the conclusions would reignite one of Egypt's oldest mysteries. The AI's role was simple in theory, but powerful in practice. Researchers took the same facial comparison that had once relied on expert observation and expanded it across every available measurement ever recorded. Instead of a single specialist examining a handful of features, the system processed thousands of individual data points collected over decades. Then it asked one straightforward question. Does the face of the Great Sphinx actually match the ruler it has been attributed to for more than a century? Dr. Miriam Osei, the forensic analyst assigned to review the results, reportedly checked the calculations more than once before offering a conclusion. When the final comparison appeared on her screen, she didn't rush to comment. She studied the outcome carefully. No matter which dataset was used, the same pattern emerged. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic enough to prove the face belonged to someone else entirely, but it also wasn't close enough to support a confident identification. In her assessment, she wrote that if the Sphinx's face were treated like an unidentified subject in a forensic investigation, Khafre would not be returned as a confirmed match. The result would be classified as inconclusive, and that single word is where this entire story changes. Not proven wrong, not proven right, inconclusive. For over 100 years, the public has largely been told the mystery was settled. An inconclusive result doesn't provide a new answer, but it reopens a question many believed had already been answered. For some observers, that distinction carries enormous significance. Generations of researchers, historians, and ordinary people who questioned the traditional identification were often told the debate was over. Now, a forensic review suggests the discussion may not be as closed as many assumed. And perhaps the most surprising part is that the conclusion came from a system that wasn't invested in defending any historical narrative. It simply evaluated the measurements it was given. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did, make sure you're subscribed. Because the story becomes even more complicated from here. Because another piece of the puzzle appeared long before artificial intelligence entered the conversation. Years earlier, respected Egyptologist Rainer Stadelmann, former director of the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, pointed to something unusual about the monument itself. The head appears unusually small when compared to the massive body beneath it. To Stadelmann, the proportions looked off. His theory was that the head may have been altered sometime after the monument's original creation. Rather than being carved exactly as we see it today, he suggested it could have been recut and reduced from an earlier design. Think about what that means. Long before AI analyzed a single measurement, one of the world's leading Egyptologists was already proposing that the face visible today might not be the monument's original face. When researchers revisited the geometry of the Sphinx in 2026, the computer models arrived at a remarkably similar observation. The relationship between the head and the body doesn't appear entirely seamless. Instead, it raises the possibility that different stages of work may have occurred at different times. And then we come to another controversy that has refused to disappear despite decades of criticism. Back in the early 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch examined the enclosure surrounding the Sphinx, the massive trench carved into the bedrock around it. What caught his attention wasn't the monument itself. It was the weathering. The erosion patterns looked unusual. Rather than matching the effects typically associated with wind-blown sand, some sections appeared more consistent with long-term water exposure. The rock displayed deep vertical channels and rounded features that Schoch believed resembled damage caused by sustained rainfall. That interpretation immediately sparked debate. The reason is obvious. Egypt has not experienced that kind of heavy rainfall for thousands of years. If Schoch's interpretation were correct, and many Egyptologists strongly disagree with it, the core structure of the Sphinx could potentially date to a much earlier period than the reign of Khafra. To be clear, the AI analysis did not prove Schoch right. But when researchers compared the erosion patterns against long-term climate models, they were unable to completely eliminate the possibility he had raised decades earlier. A theory that many considered settled suddenly returned to the category of unresolved. Now, place all of these pieces side by side. A face that doesn't perfectly align with the ruler traditionally associated with it. A head that may have been modified after the monument was first carved. And erosion patterns that some researchers argue could point to a far older origin. None of those ideas were invented by artificial intelligence. Every one of them came from real scholars, real fieldwork, and real debates that have existed for years, sometimes for decades. The difference is that in 2026, all of those arguments were finally examined together within the same analytical framework. Separately, each claim is easy to dismiss. Viewed together, they become much harder to ignore. Because if the face we see today was altered at some point in the distant past, two obvious questions immediately follow. What did the original face look like? And who was it intended to represent? Those questions remain unanswered. Yet they are not new questions. Researchers, historians, and independent scholars have been asking them for generations, long before artificial intelligence entered the discussion. The AI didn't invent the mystery. It simply forced people to look at it again. And before we move on, there's one more popular story that deserves a closer look: the missing nose. Most people have heard the same explanation, that Napoleon's troops blasted it away with cannon fire during the French campaign in Egypt. It's a great story. The problem is that it probably isn't true. We know this because of something much simpler than modern technology. Old drawings. European travelers sketched the Sphinx without its nose, decades before Napoleon ever arrived in Egypt. Illustrations from the 1730s already show the monument in its damaged condition. So whatever destroyed the nose happened much earlier. One of the earliest written accounts comes from the 15th century Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, who recorded a tradition claiming that a Sufi holy man deliberately damaged the face. According to that account, the damage was intentional. The story says that in the 1370s, a Sufi holy man deliberately struck the Sphinx's face after seeing local people leave offerings at the monument. Believing those practices were a form of idol worship, he reportedly decided to destroy part of the face. Whether every detail of that story is historically accurate is still debated. But one thing is clear: it tells us far more than the popular Napoleon legend ever could. People living centuries closer to the Sphinx than we are already viewed its face as something powerful enough to be deliberately damaged. That happened long before modern archaeology, long before Egyptology became an academic discipline, and long before anyone began measuring its features with scientific precision. So where does all of this leave us? It's important to be honest about what the 2026 AI analysis did, and just as importantly, what it did not do. It did not reveal the name of a different pharaoh. It did not prove exactly who commissioned the Sphinx, and it certainly did not settle the debate over Robert Schoch's water erosion theory once and for all. Instead, it accomplished something arguably more significant. It revisited three long-standing arguments that had each been pushed aside at different times, and found that none of them simply disappear when examined carefully. The forensic comparison still raises questions. The possibility that the head was recarved remains plausible, and the erosion evidence cannot be dismissed outright. For years, each of those ideas existed in isolation, individual challenges to an already accepted narrative. Standing alone, they were relatively easy to ignore. Placed side by side, however, they begin to form a picture that deserves a closer look. At this point, the evidence leaves us with three reasonable possibilities, and fairness requires considering all of them, rather than pretending only one deserves attention. The first possibility is that the traditional view is ultimately correct. The face may indeed represent Pharaoh Khafre, while the differences in proportion are simply the result of thousands of years of erosion, repeated restoration efforts, and the unavoidable difficulty of comparing a heavily weathered monument with carefully carved royal statues. The second possibility is that the monument's head was altered sometime after the original construction. If that happened, then the face visible today could be a later redesign placed onto an older monument, meaning the original appearance may be something history can no longer fully recover.